Captain Adams with the Task Force Dark Rifles here, just talking about the planes of warfare and IO. Today we're going to do a video on the information domain. This is one of the most important domains to really understand just beneath the cognitive domain. That's how I rank them personally. I think they're all important in their own facet, but to really understand the information domain is really how you're going to affect the cognitive domain. Like I said, the US military spends a lot of time focusing and training soldiers trying to understand the physical domain. But today I want to talk about a concept we don't really spend as much time in the military explaining to our soldiers. So, without further ado, let me get started. So the information domain. The thing to note about that is in order to understand it, you have to first divest yourself of all bias. You have to be completely unbiased in your look and approach to information. So for the course of this video, I'm going to give you multiple examples of what different types of information might be within the environment. But I want you to think, before you look at any of this, is you have to understand and you have to look at it with no bias. Because in order to understand how the enemy thinks, which goes back to our original Sun Tzu quote, which we'll put right here, in order to think of how the enemy understands the world around him, you first have to take your Western values, your American values, your Judeo-Christian values. You have to put those aside for a moment and put yourself in the shoes of the enemy so that you can understand it. In order to do that, you first have to understand how to separate yourself from all bias. This is kind of difficult, but once you start getting into the habit, you'll get better and better and better, and it becomes easier and easier and easier. And you'll find that you can use this for multiple aspects of your life, not just the military. You can use this for business, for sales, for relationships. You can start to look at things critically, not emotionally. And that's what we're trying to get to, is we don't want to cloud our judgments with emotion. We want to understand things from a scientific, from a critical thinking level, so we can then inject the information that we want later on, which we'll cover in the next video. But first off, let me give you a quick quote. I think it's going to frame the whole concept here, and it'll be a good segue into our next part, right? So, surprise is an event that occurs in the mind of an enemy commander. So think about this for a moment, right? If I know that you're coming to hit me from my left flank, is it a surprise anymore? You, the blue force commander, might think it's a surprise, but me as the red force commander, I'm not surprised because I saw you coming, right? So it's what I know. It's the information that I have received that tells me what is happening. So if I know it's coming, is it a surprise? You think it's a surprise because you don't know that I've found you out. But if I have not found you out, then it is a surprise because I did not have that information. So take that concept for a moment and just digest it. Maybe take a second to pause the video, because I think understanding this quote will really help unlock the door to the rest of what we're about to cover. So, information flows through various methods, especially in modern day. Historically, there were fewer methods in which information would flow, but today there's just a couple more, right? So I'm going to talk about a couple, right? So the methods of information. So there's no right, there's no wrong, they're all different, and they all vary based on where you're at, and some are used more so than others. But let's just give an example, right? Radio, TV, news, you have like print media, so think like newspapers, things of that nature. You have social media. And finally, you have just the plain old internet, right? Now, I know there could be plenty more on here. You could put runners, you could put speeches, you could put town criers. There's a lot of different ways. And I don't want to necessarily bog this video down on trying to explain all the different methods of information flow, because for every culture, every human civilization, there's different methods, right? It could be smoke signals for all I know. But the point that I want you to understand here is that in order to affect the information environment, we have to first know how it flows, right? How does it physically get from one place to another? Which then ties back to our last video we talked about on the physical domain. When we understand how things move about, how information is transmitted, it'll tell us how we can do things. Okay, so now that we understand the different methods in which you can affect the information environment, let's talk about some examples, because I think this is where you're going to get the most out of this video. So again, you need to divest yourself of all bias, right? But let's take for a moment some ISIS promotional videos, right? From an American perspective, or maybe a Western perspective, we do not like these videos, right? They're not our favorite, we are disgusted by them. But when you think about the target audience in which they're aimed towards, they're quite effective, right? So for instance, why is it that the ISIS always loads sniper rounds, or load their sniper rounds with tracer ammunition? The reason for that is for the video, it's for the Instagram, right? It's so that you can see where that round impacts. That's the only reason. They understand why. And it's to send a certain message to their target audience, which is young, impressionable teenage men who they're looking to join their cause. So the information, think about it this way. From an American perspective, when I see, hear, read about something like this, I get upset and I get angry. That's what happens in my brain. But from maybe a person who's grown up in the Middle East who's sympathetic to this, they might become inspired. The same information was transmitted, right? There was no change. I didn't change what the information was. I didn't change it. But based on my background, my cultural beliefs, my heritage, who I am as a person, I took that information and understood it differently. And we're going to talk more about that in the next video, but think about that concept as I give you a couple other examples. So you got the ISIS promotional videos. Another one, I'm going to draw a quick picture for you, and I hope and this should give you an example of what's going on here. Okay, so imagine here I've got a picture of some fish, right? So they're fish, they're happy, they're swimming in a line. But you have one fish that's up front. That is the information. We're not trying to assign any bias to it. We're not trying to assign any cultural context. This is what it is. You see it as this way. Now, if I was to ask you as a Western thinker, what do you think about this picture? Most people would say, oh, well, you have a group of fish, and this blue fish must be a leader, or he's leading the pack, or he's in charge, or something like that. That's what the blue fish is doing in this example. Now, if I take this same picture and I show it to somebody of a Chinese upbringing, this would be the response that they would give me. Well, you have this pack of fish, but why is this blue fish out front? He must have been ostracized from the group. He's not a part of the collective. What did the blue fish do wrong to not be included in the group? Why is he ostracized? Why is he not a part of the group? So the same information was displayed, but based on where I grew up from, my cultural heritage, they interpreted it differently. All right, so another example I want to give you guys is something that is kind of near dear to us here in Poland with the dark rifles. It's the concept of the third Rome. So when I say the word third Rome, a lot of Western thinkers, especially folks from America, we might not necessarily understand what this whole entire concept is, right? So when I say the word third Rome, you might have such a neutral perspective to it, which is fine. It is, like I've said previously, it's just raw information. That's all it is. There's nothing, no context, no bias, nothing attached to it. Now, as a Westerner, you have no inclinations towards this. You're just neutral to it. Now, if you are from Russia, for instance, it means a lot more. So, in Russian culture, they believe that they are the true seat of Christianity, specifically Moscow. The Russian Orthodox Church considers itself to be the third Rome. After the schism, back in the earlier church periods, there's a debate between the Catholics and the Orthodox. And ever since then, Russia and the Russian people, a large part of their culture, a lot of their heritage, a lot of their background and belief about themselves is that they are the true seat of Christianity. That Moscow is actually where the seat of Christianity is supposed to be at. So think about that for a second. From an informational perspective, it is what it is, right? I can put the words Third Rome on a poster. I can write it down in a book. It has no context to it. It has no understanding. It only means something when you apply your cultural backgrounds, your heritage, things of that nature. The next concept I want to talk to you guys about is something that's near and dear to us in Washington. Now, if you're watching this video and you've never really been to Washington before, or you've never really participated in any collegiate sports, if I write the Apple Cup up here on the board, you're probably wondering, well, what are you talking about, right? An apple, a cup, is it like a juice box? Is this some sort of cup of juice? What are you trying to get with this, right? And that's okay to understand it that way. But if you grew up in Washington State and you happen to also live and go to one of the universities, whether you went to University of Washington, UW, or you went to the Washington State University, whichever one you went to, you're going to have strong emotional ties to these two words. Now again, remember, try to divest yourself of all bias, right? Now, if you're trying to think from a military planning perspective, I have no bias. You need to have no bias to this. You need to understand. And then you need to put yourself in the minds of your combatants, the minds of your enemies, to understand where they're coming from. Why is the Apple Cup so important to them? So for those of you that don't know, maybe watching this video for the first time, never been to Washington before, the Apple Cup is a collegiate football game between the two largest universities in Washington, University of Washington and Washington State University. Every year they go toe-to-toe and they try to beat each other in a game of football. And every year it's a very large fanfare, tons of spectators, tons of money. It's such a big thing. And the biggest part about the whole thing is at the end of the day, whoever wins or loses, one team gets bragging rights for the next year. And that's the important bit. And they want to be able to hold that as like, we are the best university. So the whole concept behind this, right, it's just pure information. There's no bias associated with it. It doesn't mean anything until you put a human's cognitive belief on it. So understanding that, you can then manipulate it. All right, so the next concept I want you guys to think about, just another example. I really want to fill this video full of examples because it's really critical for you to understand the information itself, right? Taking yourself out of your Western values, taking yourself out of your Judeo-Christian values, and being able to put yourself and look at something from a critical standpoint. Look at something analytically. Don't put any bias on it. Just look at it as it is, right? So, another one, right? Japanese, let me see if I spell this right. Seppuku, right? Also known as harikiri. So, World War II, American soldiers fighting in the Pacific, American Marines fighting in the Pacific, they would encounter Japanese who had taken a sword into their belly and then slit themselves, killing themselves on the spot. From a Western society, this just seems crazy. Why would you do this? Why would you kill yourself? It doesn't make sense. Why not at least fight dying for your country or something of that nature? Like suicide just doesn't seem like the right answer to whatever the problem is. Again, you need to take yourself out of the bias. Remember that a lot of Asian cultures, specifically Japan, China, Korea, they are an honor-shame culture, right? A lot more, we'll talk a little bit about this more, but I want you to think for a second. If your honor was tainted, the only way to get it back was through suicide. So in the minds of a Japanese soldier during World War II, a Japanese officer, this was an honorable solution. And Americans, we can't wrap our brains around this. This doesn't make sense. It goes against all our values, our upbringing, our heritage, all of those different things. But realizing this is super important, right? What information does it send? So from an American perspective, I hear somebody committing seppuku or harikiri. I look at that and my understanding is, why did you do that? From a Japanese perspective, their understanding is that man died with honor. Same information was sent, the same act occurred, the same event took place, but our understanding of it is completely different based on where you're from. All right, another example. Again, I want to give you examples, as many as I can. If I write these words up on the board, I want you, from a Western perspective, to tell me what you think. World War II champs, or maybe I write defenders of Europe. For those that are in America, have been to America, we'll sometimes jokingly say that we're back-to-back World War II champs, that we came in, we defended Europe twice, that we've got a reigning title, we got the big belt that goes with it. And we'll also say that we're the defenders of Europe. That's what we think from our American perspective. Now, let's take a look at it from a different perspective. What if I was to say this to a Russian? Maybe just a Slavic person from the eastern side of Russia, or eastern side of Europe, whether it's Ukraine or someplace like that. So if you said those same words to them, they're going to give you a complete different answer. They're going to have a different perspective on it. See, Russia, they saw themselves as the defenders of Europe long before America was even considered, was even a thought, before America was even discovered. So a little bit of history for you. You have Moscow right here. And you have the Volga River that runs all the way around. But the thing about it, during this ancient period in time, you had the Mongol horde, right? The Golden Horde, and it was coming from all through the east, and it was just barreling down on Europe. And the things that Russia sees themselves, they're the ones that ultimately stopped, or at least thwarted, the majority of the Mongol horde from ever getting to the rest of Europe. Right? They bore the brunt. Even to this day, there's a big pride in Russian culture as far as they're the ones that defend themselves from the Mongol horde. Now let's take this again, right? Let's look at maybe a little bit more modern, but not as old. There's this man called Napoleon Bonaparte. Again, Napoleon Bonaparte pushed himself all the way up to Moscow. At this point in time, he had taken almost all of Europe. And if it wasn't for the fact of the Russian winter and the strength of arms of the Russian soldiers, Europe would have fallen again to France. So again, Moscow, Russian citizens, Russian soldiers, they see themselves as the defenders of Europe. Because who were the ones that actually defeated Napoleon initially and started the cascading events that led to his ultimate demise and fall at Waterloo? The Brits will lovingly say that they're the ones that ultimately took Napoleon out. But the Russians, from their perspective, will tell you that they're the ones that defended Europe and took it back and were able to save all of that. So, another interesting perspective. All right, maybe a third example of World War II champs, defenders of Europe. So you have Stalingrad right here, way down here in the south. And guess what? You have the Axis, specifically the Nazi powers, pushing an entire force to try to take Stalingrad. Little fun fact for you. I don't have the numbers memorized, but I know the stats well enough to give you a really good example. The total number of Russian casualties that were suffered in Stalingrad for that one battle was more than all of the Allies' casualties combined throughout both the Pacific and the the European theater. Now think about that for a second. This one battle had more Russian casualties than all of the US, British, French, every other nation, all of those folks combined across the rest of World War II. Just this one battle. So the Russia, they see themselves as the ones who bled and died for the salvation and the saving of Europe, right? That's why they then pushed them back, they took it up to Berlin, so on and so forth. But if it wasn't for the Russians who were the ones that if it wasn't for the Russians who were the ones that died and bled for their country and bled for Europe, Europe would be a different place. So they themselves see themselves as the defenders of Europe. So now you think about this for a second. Well, why does this matter? Why does this one concept matter so much? You see, in American society, we like to tout and flout about how amazing we were and how we won World War II, and we very much so marginalize and neglect the Russian input, the Russian influence, right? Because shortly after World War II, we went into the Cold War, and really Russia wasn't necessarily our friend at this point in time. So when you put that into perspective, of course we were going to downplay their contributions. And up to this day, there's this schism in the thoughts and beliefs as far as who were the ones that actually defended Europe. And the Russians have a very strong, compelling argument as far as, well, they had the most number of people lost, they had the most number of people that were killed, they had the most people that were maimed and wounded and injured, so on and so forth. And you put this into perspective, right? Now, when I say the words World War II champ or defenders of Europe, it has a different connotation depending on where you're from. All right, 2 more examples, and I promise you, these will be good ones. So, if you walk into a modern day Catholic, maybe Protestant, Orthodox church, you've got no problems. You can just walk right in. Sometimes you might, if maybe it's a Catholic church, you can get some holy water. You might need to take a knee and pray. But those are pretty normal things. Now, if you walk into a mosque, for instance, and any one of my fellow soldiers who have ever deployed to the Middle East, you'll know the very first thing you need to do is take your shoes off. Simple act, right? Now, when you think about it from just if you divest yourself of all bias and you look at this from as least perspective you can, it doesn't make sense, right? Like, why should I take my shoes off? It doesn't make sense. From a non-Islamic believer's perspective, there's no rhyme or reason to the action, right? But you put, again, cultural, religious, heritage, beliefs on a certain action, and it has a whole different meaning, right? If I walk into a mosque with my shoes on and I walk all over the carpets, I would offend people. But if you do the same thing in a church, there's no offense had, right? So same types of location, both places of religion, places of worship, but one simple change in the action and you'll have a totally different reaction. But again, if you look at it, you divest yourself of all bias, try to remove any religious connotations you have to it, it doesn't make sense. But that's not the point. The point is that you have to sit here as an IO practitioner, as an Army officer, and you have to think for a second. It matters to them, and that's the important bit. And if you understand what matters to them, then you can affect it. All right, last example. This one's kind of interesting, but if you say, for instance, like, God, if you say those words, has next to no meaning for most people, right? It's kind of ambivalent. You say this to a devout Christian, maybe a devout Jewish or devout Muslim, it'll have a totally different connotation associated with it. So again, divest yourself of all bias. You look at this, the information is the same. The words that are written, the words that are said, they are the same. But again, when you put your own bias on it, it changes what the outcome is. It changes what you do. It might anger, it might upset, right? It might change somebody's beliefs about something. So, I want you to take all of these examples and think about them. Think about why we choose to understand these simple examples, right? The reason we do that from an information operations perspective is we want to manipulate. We want to present a picture of something that maybe is not true, or maybe is true, or we want to emphasize something. At the end of the day, it all feeds the cognitive domain, right? We want to influence a certain belief. And in order to influence a certain belief, we have to present a certain picture, right? So without committing, when you go back to our original concept, right, where you had the Mongol horde, the Assyrian Empire, the Romans, right? It was always through brutality that they incurred deterrence, that they incurred victory. But here, that's not how we want to conduct warfare. So on the next video, I'm going to talk about the cognitive domain. We're going to talk more in depth about that concept of how do we change somebody's cognitive beliefs without committing atrocities, without going down that path. So again, this is Captain Adams with the Dark Rifles. See you again in the next video.